Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 383. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot of really important news to get to in today's show, so if you can, share the show. If you're a new listener, subscribe to the show, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version. Follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. I'm the opinion editor at the antiwar.com, so you can find the show on the blog there. I'm the news editor at the Libertarian Institute, so you can find my writing and the show at the Institute. And thank you all so much for tuning in. Let's get into it. The first article I have today is from Responsible Statecraft, and it's by Connor Eccles. Congress is finally poised to repeal the Iraq War Authorization. Is Afghanistan next? And Connor writes, a bipartisan group of lawmakers in the House and the Senate introduced a bill on Thursday that will repeal the congressional authorization for the use of military force from 1991 and the 2003 Iraq War. The proposal will almost certainly make it through the House, where a smaller measure passed each of the last 2 years. The question lies with the Senate, which has been wary to sign off on the House's repeal efforts. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer signaled Thursday that he is determined to end the trend, and urgently likely driven in part by the fact that next month will mark the 20th anniversary of the Second Iraq War. I will work with Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young to move this bipartisan legislation to the Senate floor so the Senate can pass it quickly, he said. President Joe Biden has also promised to support the repeal of the 2002 authorization, which provided a legal basis for the Second Iraq War. If passed, the sponsors of the bill include Representative Chip Roy, a Republican from Texas, Abigail Spanberger, Democrat from Virginia, Barbara Lee, Democrat from California, Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts, Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, as well as Senators Robert Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, and then Mike Lee and Rand Paul, who I'm sure people in my audience are generally familiar with. Their Republicans. Endless wars weaken our national security, robs this and future generations through skyrocketing debt, and creates more enemies to threaten us, Paul said in a statement. It's long past time we respect the balance of power and reassert Congress's voice by forcing legislators to specifically approve or disapprove of the direction of our foreign policy. A successful repeal would be a major victory for anti-war advocates who have fought for years to rein in what they view as potential abuses of war powers. Notably, President Donald Trump cited the Second Iraq War Authorization as a justification for the 2020 strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, a move that threatened to start a major war between the United States and Iran. When you take away Congress's ability to do their job based on the Constitution, what the Constitution requires, you're fundamentally acting as an undemocratic fashion, Representative Lee told Responsible Statecraft last year. We need to debate and provide authorization to the president if we think that is necessary. Notably, the bill does not address the 2001 authorization for military force, which provides the president with the broad authority to target states or groups involved in the 9/11 attacks. This authorization has been used to justify continued intervention for the past 22 years now, including Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and several other countries where Al-Qaeda or ISIS militants are based. Lee, who cast the only vote against the 2001 AUMF, has introduced a bill to repeal it every year since 2010 and is expected to do the same this year. Given the proposal's potential impact on U.S. military operations abroad and symbolic power as the authority for underlying the war on terror, it has a significantly lower chance of passing. And this really is the critical one. The 1991 AUMF could be repealed. It's just junk legislation on the books. The 2002 AUMF, I would expect there's some people in Washington who actually don't want that repealed because they want to be able to strike non-jihadist groups in Iraq, particularly Shia militias linked to Iran. And I think what the Trump administration found is it's hard to find a legal justification to do that. without using the 2002 AUMF. And so, this will have some impact if it's passed. Of course, one of the things, this is a short article by Connor. I'm not trying to criticize. Connor Eccles does a great job for the Quincy Institute. But one of the things he doesn't mention in this article is how critical Joe Biden was in passing the 2002 AUMF. And so I do wonder, despite his campaign pledges, if he may resist signing that legislation, and if Congress could override that veto. I kind of doubt it, but I do wonder if Biden will resist signing that legislation, as he was so key in getting it passed in the first place. All right, next article from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. U.S. carries out ICBM test. The U.S. Air Force has test launched a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, the primarily land-based strategic weapon in America's nuclear arsenal. The Pentagon hailed the trial as a success, declaring that the display of military might shows Washington is willing to defend peace across the globe. As the Air Force Global Strike Command announced the weapons test on Friday, noting it was conducted at the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California the day prior. The unarmed missile was equipped with a test re-entry vehicle for the launch, traveling some 4,200 miles to the Marshall Islands. A test launch displays the heart of our deterrence mission on the world stage, assuring our nation and its allies that our weapons are capable and our airmen are ready and willing to defend peace across the globe at a moment's notice, General Thomas Basari, who heads up the Global Strike Command, said. The U.S. Air Force went on to say the test provided valuable data to ensure and continue safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, and hastened to add that the launch was not a result of the current world events. The trial on Thursday was the Pentagon's first ICBM test since last August, when a Minuteman III was fired from the same base in California. That test was delayed for several weeks, reportedly due to concerns among U.S. officials that it could escalate tensions with China. At the time, Beijing was still fuming over a high-profile visit to Taiwan by then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, carrying out an unprecedented round of military drills in the airspace and waters around the island in response. Before that, Washington outright canceled another ICBM test last April, in that case due to fears of antagonizing Russia, which had just launched its invasion of Ukraine 2 months prior. That test was initially scheduled for March, but was ultimately scrapped. In service since the 1970s, the Minuteman III is Washington's only remaining land-based nuclear-capable strategic missile deployed in underground silos distributed across the United States. And, mainly in these more western states. I think there's some in Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, on into Missouri is, I think, about as far east as they go, and then up into Montana and maybe Idaho and Wyoming. So as a part of efforts to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the military is aiming to replace the weapon with the LG-35A Sentinel sometime in the 2030s, though the new ICBM is still in the early stages of development. As we often see with U.S. weapons, they take a lot longer than they're supposed to get developed and actually reach, wherever they're supposed to be. Last year, the test of a rocket booster was slated to be used by the Sentinel, the Monosaur 11 Plus, ended in disaster after it exploded just 11 seconds after takeoff. The blast ignited a small fire at the Vandenberg base, where local firefighters were called to extinguish the flames. And so I do think that this is probably more significant than the military is playing up. Of course, this isn't a test in the sense of we want to make sure this weapons work. It is a show of force. I think with everything that's been going on in the past 2 weeks, we'll get into later with all the balloon stuff, that a lot of this is directed at China. All right. Now on to stories about the war in Ukraine, and this story is massive. From Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Ukraine relies on intelligence from U.S. for HIMARS rocket strikes. The Washington Post reported on Thursday that Ukraine is relying on coordinates provided or confirmed by the U.S. and its allies to launch strikes using U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems, a revelation that demonstrates Washington's deep involvement in the war. The HIMARS is a precision-guided artillery system, one that Ukraine has employed quite a bit in its fight against Russia. One example is on January 1st, a HIMARS strike on a facility housing Russian forces in the Donetsk killed at least 89 Russian soldiers, one of the deadliest Ukrainian attacks in the war. Citing 3 unnamed Ukrainian officials and 1 unnamed U.S. official, the Post reported that Ukraine also relies on the U.S. for targeting coordinates for similar precision weapons, including M270 multiple rocket launch systems. One senior Ukrainian official said Ukrainian forces almost never launch strikes using these weapons without coordinates provided by U.S. military personnel that are located at military bases in different countries in Europe. Top Biden administration officials have acknowledged publicly that they have been providing Ukraine with intelligence to carry out attacks on Russian forces, but the details of the cooperation were not previously known. The Post report said that Ukrainian officials identify targets they want to hit and the location, then provide that information to the U.S. military for more accurate coordinates. The U.S. military then usually sends coordinates, although sometimes they don't, and the Ukrainian forces don't fire. A senior Ukrainian official said that the cooperation shows the U.S. can provide longer-range weapons without having to worry about being used to hit inside Russian territory. You're controlling every shot anyway, so when you say, we're afraid you're going to use it for some other purposes, well, we can't do it even if we want to, the official said. But U.S. officials dispute the idea that Ukraine was running the targets by the U.S. for approval and said that the U.S. only provides coordinates. Back in August, a top Ukrainian official said that they consult the U.S. before launching HIMARS strikes and that the U.S. has veto power over the target. Ukraine could have more freedom to choose its own targets as the Biden administration is less concerned about escalating the war. Russia has made it clear that it views the U.S. and Ukraine's cooperation on targeting as an example of Washington's direct role in the war, and Moscow isn't alone in this assessment. Back in March 2022, Rep. Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington State, former chair of the House Armed Services Committee, said the U.S. was in providing real-time targeting intelligence because that kind of coordination steps over the line to making us participants in the war. Now, I guess just to maybe clarify or, square what the White House is saying compared to what Ukraine's saying, my guess is that the White House says, well, Ukraine could do what they want no matter what we tell them. If we tell them, use these coordinates or don't strike here, they can still do it. And we're not actively suggesting targets, but, depending on how many targets Ukraine is coming to the U.S. with, they could just be essentially asking for the U.S. to locate, certain Russian bases and things like that. And then the U.S. is providing the coordinates, and then Ukraine is carrying out the strikes with U.S.-made weapons. And the Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by the U.S. and so really, other than the people on the front lines doing the fighting and dying for Ukraine, the Ukrainians, this is essentially an American war, and no doubt the Russians see it that way. So we talked last week quite a bit about Seymour Hersh's article. I really recommend going back and listening to last week's show from Wednesday if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about here. There's just so much in that article I don't want to go through and break down. But essentially, Seymour Hersh, the legendary reporter, has a source and a lot of corroborating facts that point to the U.S. as having planned prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the sabotage, the detonation, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and then carried it out along with Norway this past summer. So Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, on Wednesday wrote on Twitter that he can't immediately rule out the idea that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia and Germany. Lee's comments came after a veteran investigative journalist, Seymour Hersh, published an explosive report that detailed how the U.S. sabotaged the pipelines in coordination with Norway, allegations the White House denied. I am troubled that I cannot immediately rule out the suggestion that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream. I checked out with a bunch of Senate colleagues. Among those I have asked, none of us were briefed on this. It turns out to be true. We've got a huge problem. According to Hersh's report, which cites a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning, Congress didn't need to be notified of the plans to blow up the pipelines because it was downgraded from being a covert operation. The reason for this was because President Biden publicly threatened the Nord Stream 2 pipeline after the CIA came up with the plan of attack. If Russia invades, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We will bring it to an end, Biden said on February 7th. Hersh's source, that's February 7th of last year, 2022. Hersh's source said that Biden's threat, senior CIA officials determined that the plan was no longer a covert operation because the president just announced that we know how to do it. According to the report, the operation was then downgraded from a covert operation to highly classified intelligence operation with the U.S. military support. The source said that because of the change, there was no longer a legal requirement to report the operation to Congress. The report said that the Navy divers planted C4 explosives on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines in June during NATO drills in the region. The explosions were later detonated in September by sonar buoy dropped by a Norwegian spy plane. And I agree with this. There's a huge problem if the U.S. did this. There's even a bigger problem if they did it as an end run around Congress. I mean, this is directly trampling on the Constitution, which does happen all the time. But, you know, for the president to launch an attack on Russia without even notifying Congress would probably, it may even be a step too far. And we could see, you know, maybe the Republicans in Congress try to do something about this. Although, you know, for reasons that I discussed on past shows, I am skeptical that we're really going to get any good answers here. All right, so next update to camp February 12th, antiwar.com. Pentagon wants to restart special operations programs inside Ukraine. The Pentagon is looking to restart special operations programs that it was conducting inside Ukraine before Russia invaded last year, the Washington Post reported on Friday. The programs, known as surrogate operations, involve employing Ukrainian operatives to track Russian military movements and conduct information warfare. The Ukrainians are involved in the programs will be overseen by U.S. Special Operations troops. The surrogate operations inside Ukraine first began in 2018 and were suspended before the invasion. The information warfare program involved using bloggers to counter so-called Russian disinformation. We have people taking apart Russian propaganda and telling the true story on blogs, an unnamed person involved in the special operations told the Post. The other program involved U.S. commandos sending Ukrainians on reconnaissance missions in eastern Ukraine, where a civil war had been raging since 2014, that sparked by a U.S.-backed coup. We trained surrogates to go and collect signals intelligence off Russian radar batteries, stuff like that, a U.S. government official told the Post. Restarting the program would likely involve deploying U.S. troops to Ukraine, although it's possible they could direct surrogates from outside the country. The Post said there is no known U.S. troop presence in Ukraine besides U.S. personnel based at the embassy in Kiev. The Intercept reported in October that U.S. Special Forces were in the country, as well as CIA operatives. The Pentagon is still trying to convince Congress to authorize the resumption of the surrogate programs in Ukraine, and it says it will involve non-combat operations, but there is skepticism among lawmakers. A U.S. official familiar with the talks told the Post, "What we started as reconnaissance missions can quickly turn to combat when the surrogates start getting shot at. I think it's a real possibility in Ukraine. I'm not sure how the department is going to change people in Congress's minds about that. If the programs are reauthorized, it would mark another dramatic escalation of U.S. involvement in the war and make direct clash with Russia more likely. Whether the U.S. troops are deployed to Ukraine or run the surrogates from another country, Moscow would likely view it as a major provocation." as well as the next couple stories we have, major provocations. Ukraine is prepared to strike Crimea with British missiles. Ukraine's in discussions with the UK about receiving longer-range missiles and is prepared to use them against Crimea, which reported another major escalation of Western involvement in the war, the Times of London reported on Thursday. And notice that, all these reports, they're from the Washington Post, they're from the Times of London. These are from mainstream sources. They're saying that we're going to get these escalations now. The British Prime Minister promised more aid from Kiev when Ukrainian President Zelensky visited London on Wednesday. The Times reported that discussions are now underway on whether future aid should include Harpoon anti-ship missiles or air-launched Storm Shadow missiles. Ukrainian sources told the Times that they would plan to use these missiles to hit Crimea, strikes that would seriously risk provoking Moscow. Both U.S. and British officials are less concerned about escalating the war. Ukraine has already received some Harpoon missiles from Denmark and launchers from the U.S. The anti-ship missiles have a range of about 70 miles, although other variants can hit targets over 100 miles away. The Harpoon have longer ranges than artillery missiles the U.S. has sent, but Harpoons are designed for coastal defense. It's not clear if Ukraine could use Harpoons in its ground battle against Russia with the current launchers, but Ukrainian officials claimed they used them to sink a Russian military tugboat last June. The Times reports that the Harpoons could be less accurate if they were used on the ground. The Storm Shadow missiles could hit targets at a range between 150 and 350 miles, depending on the variant. They are typically fired from aircraft. The UK is also considering providing Kiev with fighter jets and plans on training Ukrainian pilots starting this spring. Moscow would view the provision of jets and longer-range missiles as a major provocation, and Russian officials have been warning strongly against the move. Recent reports suggest the U.S. and its allies are no longer concerned with the risk of Russian Vladimir Putin using nuclear weapons in response to an attack on Crimea, based only on the fact that he hasn't used them up until this point. And just to go along with that report, British weapons could be manufactured in Ukraine. The Telegraph reports the UK arms industry is in talks with Ukraine about making weapons inside the country. British officials could soon be manufactured in Ukraine under a plan that would require significantly boost cooperation between Kiev and NATO and further raise tensions with Moscow, the Telegraph reported on Saturday. The report said the UK defense industry executives are discussing the plans with their Ukrainian counterparts and have recently traveled to the country. My guess is, as we've seen, this escalation probably will happen. SpaceX limits Ukraine's use of Starlink, says it shouldn't be weaponized. The president of SpaceX said Wednesday that the company has limited Ukraine's use of Starlink terminals and that the company's intention wasn't for the satellite internet service to be weaponized. The the president, said that media reports that Ukraine was using Starlink to spot targets with drones. There are things that we can do to limit their ability to do that. There are things that we can do and have done, she said in a space industry conference in Washington, D.C. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk says his company has begun providing Starlink terminals to Ukraine shortly after the Russia invasion. The president said that the terminals were never meant to be weaponized. However, Ukrainians have leveraged it in ways that were unintentional and not a part of any agreement, she said. The president continued that it was okay for Ukraine's military was using Starlink for comms, but the country never intended them to have use for offensive purposes. And, in some sense, I do think that the Starlink is kind of trying to split hairs here by saying that, this is offensive or just communication is different. I think anytime you're doing business with the military, you're essentially helping them to kill people. But that a lot of the SpaceX stuff has received some pretty sharp criticisms from Ukraine anytime they waffled at all about how much support they're going to give Kiev. So maybe this is a little piece of good news to, oh no, this isn't the end of the Russia section. Representative Matt Gaetz leads resolution calling for an end to support for Ukraine, pushes for peace. Representative Gaetz introduced a resolution on Thursday that called for an immediate end to U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine and urges the warring sides to negotiate a ceasefire. The Ukrainian fatigue resolution was introduced by Gaetz and received 10 other co-sponsors. If passed, it will express that it is the sense of the House that the United States must end its military and financial aid to Ukraine and urges all other combatants to reach a peace agreement. Throughout the war, Gaetz has been critical of U.S. support for Ukraine and has called for an end to the policy. President Joe Biden must have forgotten his prediction from March 2022, suggesting that arming Ukraine with military equipment will escalate this conflict into World War III. Gaetz said in a statement on the resolution, America is in a state of managed decline, and it will be exacerbated if we continue this hemorrhage taxpayer dollars towards a foreign war. We must spend all foreign aid for the West and Ukraine and demand that all combatants in this conflict reach a peace agreement immediately. The other co-sponsors for this resolution are Reps Andy Bridges, Laura Blaubert, Paul Gosselaar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Anna Pauline Luna, Thomas Massey, Mary Miller, Barry Moore, Ralph Norman, and Matt Rosendale. Gates' resolution notes that the U.S. has already authorized to send over $110 billion to spend on the war in less than a year. The introduction comes after a series of escalations of U.S. military aid, including M1 tanks, and Ukraine is now seeking fighter jets from the U.S. So I don't think this resolution has much of a chance, but we could at least get some more insight into how many House Republicans, and if there are any Democrats, who are interested in containing this war at all, since the House is now led by Republicans. I think it's possible the bill could get a vote. And so another article here from Responsible Statecraft, this one by Connor Eccles again. Congress will block F-16 sale to Turkey if Turkey sinks Sweden's NATO bid, and this is from Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's a Democrat from Maryland. This is just kind of an interesting story, how all this is playing out and how hard the U.S. is trying to pressure Turkey to get to agree to NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. Now I want to move on and talk about the balloon war stuff. This is all ridiculous, but it is really important to talk about. Washington is upset Beijing did not take hotline call after balloon shoot down. I wrote this for antiwar.com on Friday. The Pentagon claims Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin could not reach his Chinese counterpart shortly after an American fighter jet shot down a craft Beijing says was a weather balloon. A department official said Chinese officials refusing to take the call on a bilateral hotline was dangerous. Last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned meeting with the Chinese foreign minister after the balloon was spotted in American skies. According to the Pentagon, Austin placed the call to Chinese defense minister shortly after the F-22 shot down the Chinese craft over the Atlantic Ocean. So this was the first balloon. Now we have a bunch more, but when I wrote this, I think this was the only one. Austin attempted to reach his Chinese counterpart on the bilateral hotline that was established between the U.S. and China. China's defense ministry spokesperson Tan Keefe explained on Thursday that Beijing didn't decline the call and that the U.S. was waging an information war. Given that this irresponsible and serious erroneous approach by the U.S. did not create a proper atmosphere for dialogue and exchanges between the two militaries, China did not accept the U.S. proposal for a phone call, he said. Tan continued, the U.S. claimed that the balloon was part of the so-called aircraft fleet. I don't know about it. I think this is part of the U.S. information war against China. Washington being upset with Beijing for being unavailable for talks is ironic, as last week America's top diplomat scrapped high-level meetings in China. The State Department claimed it did not want Blinken's meeting with the Chinese foreign minister and potentially the Chinese president to be dominated by conversations about the balloon. Assistant Secretary for Defense Eli Ratner told Congress on Thursday that Beijing's refusal to take the hotline call was dangerous. This is really dangerous. He continued, and fortunately to date, the PLA is not answering the call. So I think a part of this is just a difference in how the bureaucracy of the American versus the Chinese government works. This has happened in the past where the Chinese don't take the hotline calls right away. I think that's maybe because the Chinese government is so top down that you know, it takes a while for the bureaucracy to prepare itself to take the call and how it's going to respond to the call. Where in the U.S., you know, Lloyd Austin just picks up the phone and calls whoever he wants, whenever he wants. So President Biden continued to downplay the event this week. On Thursday, the president stated it was not a major breach. It's not a major breach. Look, the total amount of intelligence gathering that's going on by every country around the world is overwhelming, Biden inserted in an interview. Still, the presence of the balloon allowed many politicians and pundits to claim China was threatening America. On Thursday, the House unanimously passed a resolution that condemned China for the brazen violation of U.S. sovereignty. The legislation further rebuked Beijing for attempting to deceive the international community about the purposes of its intelligence gathering campaigns. On Wednesday, the Pentagon doubled down on its claim that the balloon was a spy craft, but did not provide the American people with evidence. This was not for civilian purposes. We are 100% clear on that, Department of Defense spokesperson General Pat Ryder said. On Friday, China responded sharply to the resolution. Foreign Minister Mao Ning claimed that the legislation was political manipulation. The resolution by U.S. Congress was purely political manipulation and hyping up, he said, and I do think he's essentially correct in that. And then this is the other article I wrote for the antiwar.com on Friday. Shortly after the first, U.S. military shot down unidentified object near Alaska, and so this was the second balloon the U.S. downed. The White House claimed the Pentagon downed an unknown object off the coast of Alaska. The Joe Biden administration downplayed the incident, claiming the craft was only shot down as a precaution. The American officials could not confirm what kind of object the U.S. fighter jet intercepted, while the White House press secretary John Kirby said President Biden ordered the military action. President Biden ordered the military to shoot down the object, and they did, he stated. Now, this morning or yesterday, I'm not sure which day, but either Monday or Sunday, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer confirmed that the military believes all these objects are balloons. Kirby stated that the object was flying at roughly 40,000 feet and was the size of a small car. The White House said it has no idea where the object came from, why it was off the coast of Alaska, or what kind of assignment the craft may have. The New York Times cited an unnamed American official who said the object did not present a threat. There were no affirmative indications of a military threat to the people on the ground from the object, the official assured. It is too early to know what kind of equipment may have been on board the object. Still, the White House ordered the object be down, similarly to a Chinese balloon that was intercepted by an F-22 over the Atlantic Ocean. The balloon, which Washington claims was a surveillance craft and Beijing says was a weather balloon, traveled over a large portion of the U.S. without incident. China hawks in Congress capitalized on the balloon that the Department of Defense said posed no threats to Americans. Representative Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat from California, voiced it wasn't a good idea to have a spy balloon fly over the country. It must come down. Across the aisle, Senator Josh Hawley tweeted, who's a Republican from Missouri, now China is openly spying on us and the Biden administration does nothing. China is trolling us. He added, they know Biden is weak. All right, and so now we have another balloon. I think we actually have a third and a fourth here. The U.S. military shot down another flying object on Sunday over Lake Huron in Michigan, Canada's defense minister announced. The Canadian Defense Minister, Anita Anand, said the object was engaged by North American Aerospace Defense Command, that's NORAD, the command responsible for the defense of the U.S. and Canadian airspace. Today, a high-altitude object was detected in the U.S. airspace over Lake Huron. NORAD launched Canadian and U.S. aircraft to investigate. The object was taken down in U.S. airspace by a U.S. aircraft. The Pentagon said the U.S. F-16 shot down the object, which was described as octagonal. The Pentagon said it did not assess the object to be a kinetic military threat to anything on the ground, but assesses that it was a safety flight hazard and threat due to its potential surveillance capabilities. The incident marked the third time the U.S. shut down an unidentified object downing since shooting down a Chinese balloon off the coast of South Carolina. On Friday, the U.S. ordered the Pentagon to shoot down a unidentified object over the waters near Alaska. The following day, the U.S., and this is the third one, a U.S. fighter jet shot down another object over Canada. It's not clear what kind of objects were shot down since the Chinese balloon, which the U.S. claimed was a surveillance device and China insisted was a weather balloon for civilian purposes. The White House said the object shot down on Friday and Saturday did not look similar to the Chinese balloon. I think there was a considerable size difference. But yet they do believe they were all balloons. According to Chuck Schumer again. U.S. and Papua New Guinea hold talks on military agreement. The U.S. and Papua New Guinea just wrapped up talks on signing a military agreement as the Biden administration is looking to expand military ties in the Asia Pacific as a part of its strategy against China. The U.S. and Papua New Guinea held negotiations on February 6th through the 10th in Honolulu, Hawaii, to discuss the U.S. Defense Cooperation Agreement that would strengthen security cooperation between our two countries. The State Department said that the negotiations made substantial progress on the text of an agreement, signaling a deal could be reached soon. And if you look, Papua New Guinea is one of the larger land masses in the region. You have the U.S. building military bases in the Philippines, which is far closer, bases in Palau, Guam, in this region. But Papua New Guinea is a larger country than the rest, and a lot more land, even if it's a little bit less space. Next up, U.S. conducted aircraft carrier drills in the South China Sea amid balloon tensions. The U.S. military are conducting drills in the South China Sea amid heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing over the Chinese balloon incident. And this is only going to make the situation escalate worse. Why we're sending our aircraft carriers into Chinese waters at this point is absolutely absurd and a needless escalation. One last story to point out here. So the U.S. is lifting some sanctions on Syria for the next 180 days. So that's 6 months. Hopefully that could be extended. But I think we need more substantial sanctions relief. It has to be almost sweeping sanctions relief. We have found that in the past, anytime the U.S. has sanctions on a country, just nobody is willing to, all the different players that need to be involved, the shipping company, the insurance company, the whatever product is initially being bought, grain, medical supplies, all that, everybody needs to be comfortable that they're not going to get hit with U.S. sanctions. And so it may help open up some aid getting into Syria, but I think without a more sweeping sanctions relief, this is a very, very small band-aid. Of course, I believe I read this morning now, 35,000 people in Turkey and Syria are believed to have been killed by the earthquake, and I think the number in Syria is around 5,000. Terrible event. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Like I said, I had a lot of important information. Now, the next show, I'm going to be touching on something a little different. Our old friend Misty Winston is coming back, and she is located somewhat near to what is happening in Ohio with the train derailment, and then the authorities setting fire to these very carcinogenic chemicals. And so she's going to return to the show to talk about Assange and that event. So anyways, I just wanted to take a minute because it's not necessarily something that I wouldn't talk about on the show, the train derailment, but I'm having a hard time locating a lot of like better coverage on this. I did read a decent article in the AP this morning, a decent article in the Guardian, but we have the journalists on the ground being arrested. So if anybody has, either information, you're from the area, like get in touch with me. But even, any articles that you find, local sources, stuff like that, please send them along, so I have more, questions that I could ask Misty and more we could talk about. Anyways, I really appreciate y'all tuning in. We'll be back with more shows later in the week.